He wants to go live.
Okay.
After that, we can start.
Anurag, right? Yeah, now we are on live. Yeah. Good afternoon. On behalf of Bhumika National Institute, I'll welcome you all for this HBNI webinar. इसका प्रॉब्लम है? हाँ, उसमें वो यूज करो. Just see that. Sorry for some small problem. Okay. Good afternoon. On behalf of Bhumika National Institute, I welcome you all for this HBNI webinar on stronger public-private partnerships for India to achieve global leadership by Dr. Ajit Sapre, Group President, Reliance Technology Group. I inform you all that most of our dignitaries, faculty members, and students have joined online for this webinar, either on WebEx or YouTube Live. I welcome today's speaker, Dr. Ajit Sapre, and thank him for accepting our invitation to deliver this webinar on university-industry linkage. This is one area on which National Education Policy 2020 has also given a lot of emphasis. We are glad to have Dr. R. Chidambaram, DAE Homi Bhabha Chair Professor and former Principal Scientific Advisor to the Government of India with us. I extend a warm welcome to Professor Basudev Rao, Vice Chancellor HBNI, Professor Grover, Professor Emeritus and Founder Director of HBNI, Professor Joshi, Professor Emeritus HBNI, Professor Nayak, Dean HBNI, and other dignitaries attending this webinar. I also take this opportunity to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Ajit Sapre. Dr. Sapre is Group President of Reliance Technology Group in Reliance Industries Limited. He received his BChem from ICT Matunga, MBA from Cornell University, and PhD from University of Delaware. He has more than 30 years of experience in the petroleum refining and petrochemicals business, technology development and management. His experience includes technical and managerial assignments in research, engineering, licensing, business manufacturing units, and corporate planning. He has strong management and technical background in refining, petrochemicals process development, catalysis development, chemical reaction engineering, optimization technologies, computer integrated manufacturing, and intellectual asset management. He has experience in upstream, downstream, refining, petrochemicals, polyester, lubes, and renewable energy sectors. He has published more than 100 technical papers, one book, and has more than 35 US patents to his credit. I'm quite sure that you are looking forward to hearing Dr. Sapre's talk on a very important topic, stronger public-private partnerships for India to achieve global leadership. I would like to mention that you may put your queries in chat box and Dr. Sapre will be happy to address those at the end of his talk. May I now request Dr. Sapre to deliver his webinar. Dr. Sapre, please. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for the kind introduction. It is indeed an honor and privilege to be invited to give a lecture at the prestigious Homi Bhabha National Institute in front of my guru, Padma Bhushan, Professor J.B. Joshi, Dr. Chidambaram, and many other dignitaries and renowned faculty, and obviously students. I'm going to give a perspective on need for a stronger public-private partnership of India to achieve global leadership. It will be a very fast-paced presentation with a visual overload. What I suggest is read the title of a slide and the tagline, but please listen to my story. You may find it interesting. This is just a disclaimer from my lawyer, since I still work for Reliance. What this all says is that these are my personal views and in no way reflect Reliance's business strategy. This is an outline of my presentation. We in industry look at fundamentals of molecules to markets. You may not believe this, but we try to integrate the fundamentals of science, engineering, and economics with a dash of common sense. The outline is given in those bullet points. Basically, in the beginning, I'll talk a bit about some of the work we have done in India in Reliance. but then quite a bit focused on the education system and innovation system in India. And some of the challenges, you have to understand, I spent about 40 years in the US, and I've been back in India about 10 years ago to start an R&D function. So you'll get a flavor from my, I guess, experience both in the US and here. And I'll comment quite a bit on my passion about inventing and implementing technologies. So with that, let's begin. So first, let's look into the future. And these are some of the crystal ball ideas that I have put together. Almost everyone knows that we're at the cusp of the fourth industrial revolution. Unfortunately, from my perspective, India missed all previous three industrial revolutions, whether it was related to steam engines or electricity and automation and related to large-scale manufacturing. Even IT, we were just a follower from my perspective. Now we're entering the era of cognification, and my appeal to young and all is that we must capitalize on the fourth industrial revolution in India, because from my perspective, the fundamental changes will happen in the way we work, way we think, and way we relate to each other. So it's important to get into the global leadership. We absolutely must conquer the technologies of the fourth industrial revolution. For many, it may be digital technologies, but truly speaking, it's the amalgamation of physical, digital, and biological worlds. And the key thing that's going to happen from my perspective is the velocity of disruption and acceleration of innovation will be hard to comprehend or anticipate. And then we must remain agile in our thinking and very fast in action. So I'll talk a little bit about that later in the talk. But the most important thing from my perspective is the impact of the biology that's going to happen in this century. From my perspective, the digital technology is just something that's going to allow us to improve efficiency. But the biology is going to play an entirely different role. And certainly the COVID has taught us what biology can do, and we're still trying to recover from it. And if you think about the other big thing that's going to happen is really the climate change and how it's going to affect. Certainly it's going to affect the biology. The solutions, many of them will actually come from biology itself. And I'll talk a little bit about that as I go through my presentation. Now let's see, this chart kind of summarizes the technology sector leaders in the world. And it talks about on the left-hand side of various key areas. And certainly if you look at in almost all areas, US and China dominate. And the sad part is India does not have a leadership position in any sector at all. Now, if you look at the crystal ball and say what's going to happen in the next 4 or 5 years in terms of, where is the current economic growth and which are the key areas that are going to grow very, very rapidly. And if you look at these percentages based on some survey, you can clearly see the life sciences and healthcare will dominate. Energy and energy transition or sustainability is the second big area, and advanced materials is the third area, and then many other different areas. So from my perspective, the synthetic biology, and I'll talk quite a bit about synthetic biology, energy transition and advanced materials are going to be a far more important areas. And this also offers an opportunity. From my perspective, when the big disruptions happen, whether it is related to energy transition, this is an opportunity for us to actually leapfrog the world and not be just a fast follower. And so you will agree with me that the COVID has actually drastically changed the way of life. And then it will continue. I mean, certainly it is going to have a big impact on the way workflow is being adopted. For example, work from home, and then this whole interaction on the digital platform is a one clear example. But obviously the way in which the mRNA technology and the COVID vaccines got developed, it's certainly a power of synthetic biology. And in fact, worldwide, even India did fantastic in terms of developing our own vaccines, and more importantly, administering to 100 crore shots in such a short period of time is remarkable. So certainly, the COVID is going to change the way we look at life. And certainly the other big area that is going to change is really the climate change and its impact on agriculture, and the pollution has always been the challenge. But the overall picture from my perspective is that we need to build a very resilient systems, whether they're related to the way the healthcare is taken care of, or way the food systems are developed, or way the transition to new energy is going to happen. The key is resiliency, because disruption and change will probably be the most common thing. Now, since I work quite a bit in the new energy and energy transition, I'll focus quite a bit initially on the new energy aspects. and then climate change, and then talk about the synthetic biology. I'll just give you my perspective. Perhaps some of you may know, though, the Himalayan glaciers are retreating just as well as other glaciers in the world, but they're retreating at a fairly rapid rate. The two bottom charts, one on the right-hand side, essentially the CO2 concentration in atmosphere, and as everyone knows, has been steadily going up. But the one on the left-hand side actually talks about the frequency of disasters related to climate change, whether it is flooding or fires in the West. And certainly India has seen changes in our monsoon season. We do have some flash floods and we have droughts, and some of it is really unpredictable. And part of it's all related to climate change. So we need to take climate change quite seriously. Now, if you think about on this chart, even before the COVID, for India to think about Atmanirbhar Bharat and our aspiration to reach $5 trillion economy, we had significant challenges. So some of them are listed here. There's a water crisis. The climate change may affect, in Mumbai, maybe under part of the Mumbai, maybe underwater. Certainly, we have a problem with the hunger and nutrition in India. There's a pollution problem. So I'll talk quite a bit about various of these topics, including agriculture, in this presentation. And hopefully, I'll touch some key concepts about various subjects and what is it that India needs to do to really truly achieve global leadership and our $5 trillion economy. So not only I'll talk about technical aspects, but also talk about education, economy, and an overall perspective of life in general. But let's come back and begin with the climate change. Bill Gates recently wrote a very simple book, very easy to understand. And the title itself is How to Avoid Climate Disaster. And basically points out every human activity contributes to climate change, whether it's related to making things like cement, steel, or plugging in like electricity, or growing things. For example, the food itself is a major contributor to climate change, especially the animal husbandry, if you will. Certainly getting around and mobility gets a lot of attention, but the other aspects are actually more difficult to decarbonize. Certainly keeping warm and cool. And one of the things, the key concept he talks about is the fact that we are trying to replace the hydrocarbon-based technologies with green technologies. But all the green technologies today are more expensive. And so the delta between the fossil-based technologies and the green technologies, he calls it green premium. And the technical challenge ahead of us to minimize this green premium or even, in fact, reduce it completely. Now, some of us may not think climate change is that serious. And there is a principle about this common but differentiated responsibility. Essentially, it says that the rich countries cause the problem. So, obviously, we need some support in terms of technology and financing, and we need some more time to catch up, grow our economy. But the problem is that the climate change is going to affect the poor far more than the rich. And certainly, since I'm talking to the people at BARC, from my perspective, nuclear energy would play a mostly important role, not only for the resiliency, but also for the carbon-free energy needs of India. And so, from my perspective, let me give some ideas on what we have done for energy transition and biotechnology, and you may get some ideas. When I came to Reliance 10 years ago to start the R&D, this was my simple business model, if you will. I know we didn't have much of a technical capability to create new technologies, if you will. So I was quite sure we'll continue to be a smart buyer. But again, I wanted to be a very fast follower so we can capture new knowledge and improve the technologies that we license. And to be honest with you, we must have commercialized more than 40 technologies, largely of them in fast follower, only one or two which I'll call flagship. And by flagship, I really mean first to the world. So nobody has done this, and we are the only ones who have actually done it. And I'm going to give you a few examples of what we have developed, which are first to the world and which are in the pipeline to get commercialized. And certainly this was the way in which I thought about how I'm going to build a skill set and a capability, but most importantly, increase the confidence. Because one of the key things in putting up $1 billion projects and entirely new technology is to build a confidence in the funders. So this is the way in which we started to build a capability, and by implementing, demonstrated that we can do it. So certainly I'll talk about 3 key technologies. All 3 of them are based on concepts of large-scale fluid bed systems. And we've done many of these things, but I'm just giving you some glimpse of what we've done. The one on the left-hand side is called multi-zone catalytic cracking. It's actually the highest severity cracking of crude oil to chemicals that exist in the world today. And it essentially maximizes petrochemicals. So I can make more than 75% of the crude basket to petrochemicals with essentially no fuels at all. And so this is very important as the mobility takes on and becomes more electrified. This is the way to convert the fuels business to petrochemicals business. The one in the middle, I'll talk towards the end of this presentation. We are the cheapest technology to capture CO2 from a flue gas, and this will become very critical to combat climate change. And the one on the right is actually I'm very proud of because this is something in my mind could be a tremendous game changer, both to make green hydrogen from biomass. And this is really a solid chemistry, an entirely new way, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But here, I can convert the biomass to green hydrogen. But more importantly, I can also convert India's high ash coal, 45% coal without any problem to synthesis gas. And if you capture CO2 that you create and sequester it, you essentially have a carbon-free energy. This is another way for India to become energy independent and not get into dependence on getting energy from the other parts of the world. So I'm quite excited about it, but I'll talk more about this later. So let me begin with multi-zone catalytic cracking. And when I joined Reliance, my thought was that all thermal processes, I'm going to retire them and make them catalytic. So first thing I did is the steam cracking. Now we should retire steam cracking. And that's how this MCC concept came about. Obviously, that catalytic gasification came about is saying we want to go to essentially eliminate thermal gasification. So the whole idea was all the thermal processes, we started developing catalytic systems. And what we are doing here is that we are actually introducing various feeds in a single riser. It's really a very high severity operation. The catalysts are also very different. It's a multitude of catalysts. And we introduce the feed dependent upon its crackability. So the hardest to crack feed is at the bottom and the easiest to crack feed at the top. And we essentially recycle all the unconverted material to extinction. So there are no fuels left at all. So all we make is ethylene, propylene, and aromatics. And if you look at all the other technologies that others are offering in the world, MCC lifecycle cost is 10% better than all other options. And by the way, in a business where I'm in the hydrocarbon business, 1.5% is a big deal. So 10% is clearly a breakthrough technology. And there are many people who are actually chasing us. We are in the process of building a large demo, and then we'll commercialize this because it will change the Jamnagar complex completely. Now, let me talk a little bit about hydrogen. I mean, there's a lot of discussion about hydrogen. Everybody's all excited about hydrogen because that's another way for achieving deep decarbonization in many industries. Steel, cement, in fact, every aspect of life, if you have cheap enough green hydrogen, you could be quite good about energy transition. Now, if you think about there are various flavors of colors of hydrogen that I won't bore you, but today all hydrogen is made essentially from steam methane reforming, and it's actually a significant producer of CO2. If you capture that CO2 and sequester it, we call it blue hydrogen. And there's enormous effort going on in splitting the water to make hydrogen as well by electrolysis. But the cost of that hydrogen is almost factor of 3 more. And that's what the green premium that Bill Gates was talking about, that the challenge is for us to eliminate it. Now, obviously, Reliance has created a new business unit for green energy and renewable energy. And Mr. Ambani has made various announcements, and some of them are captured here. I won't go through the details, but essentially, one of the key elements he talked about was that the target for the technical community is to produce green hydrogen at less than $1 a kilogram. And obviously, it's the same target that the US DOE has for their moonshot project. And they expect that in the US, they'll achieve that level in about 10 years. Obviously, our timeline is much shorter. And I'm quite confident we'll achieve these targets much sooner than the rest of the world. Because for Reliance, we have taken a goal of achieving net zero by 2035, whereas other major hydrocarbon companies in the world are talking about net zero by 2050. So our targets are certainly far more aggressive. And we are geared to do that. But let me talk about indigenous technology of making green hydrogen from agri-biomass. And as you know, in the northern parts of India, we burn crops after the harvest. And that does create a tremendous pollution problem, especially in cities like Delhi and other parts of the northern India. And so this technology can essentially take the agri-residue and convert that to green hydrogen with catalytic gasification, which I'll talk about next slide. But this is a perfect example of a win-win where you are actually solving the pollution problem, but more importantly, you're stimulating the agri-economy by putting income in the farmer's pocket. I mean, today, all this biomass is essentially burnt off. Here, we will get some value as a feedstock. So there are two problems we're solving with this technology, but let me talk about technology itself, because that's the most interesting part. And as I discussed before, it's really a solid chemistry. And we had done a lot of work in my previous company on catalytic gasification, where we were spraying the catalyst on the coal or a petroleum coke. So one thing I told my scientists when we came to India is that we need to heterogenize this system, because part of the challenge there was to recovery of the catalyst was way too expensive. And I must compliment my team that they came up with a solid catalyst. And we also came with an entirely new novel catalysis we call migratory catalysis, on how do the actually gasification happens. And this is primarily a steam gasification, which happens at significantly milder conditions. So unlike thermal gasifications, we are at a almost factor of 250 degrees centigrade milder. Since it's primarily a steam gasification, we produce significantly higher amount of hydrogen. But most importantly, we actually use the burning of the coke on the catalyst and some carbon feed itself to provide the heat of reaction needed for gasification. And as a result, we don't need the oxygen that is typically used for conventional thermal gasifiers. We're using air, and that lowers the capex as well as the opex. So we are 40% lower in capex and opex both compared to any thermal gasification that exists in the world today. The most importantly, when you are doing biomass gasification, most of the technologies produce significant amount of tar. But since we use a catalyst, there is obviously no tar at all that we form. So it's a very, very clean and simple system. And so we are actually building a demo plant to show it on a biomass. But more importantly, and I felt strong enough that I've been talking to Niti Aayog for almost 5 years, saying that we are demonstrating this technology all the way through a large-scale pilot plant. And this could actually help India achieve energy independence in monetizing our high ash coal. And we demonstrated technology at a pilot scale on high ash coal as well. And I think in the last meeting a few months back, Niti Aayog is seriously considering putting up one of the trains on coal with our technology. So we'll see how that goes, but I'm really excited about this development. Now let me talk about once you make hydrogen, say green hydrogen, in the mobility sector, certainly for heavy duty vehicles, fuel cells are much better than any electric option of battery, simply because the dead weight of a battery is just way too high. And beyond certain limit, the range and the ability to haul, whether it is the big trucks or the ships, is going to be impossible with any battery technology today or in the foreseeable future. And the fuel cell is nothing but another way in which you can power, it's again an electric car. And certainly Reliance has made many announcements about both fuel cells as well as batteries, as well as the solar cells itself. So anyway, I had worked on fuel cells myself in my previous companies in late 90s. So when I came to the US, when I came to India back, I worked with CSR labs under the NIMITLI program and started to develop our own fuel cell technology. And actually started to scale it up with the industry here in Pune. And certainly that experience is going to help us in trying to create a big, large-scale fuel cell business. And certainly we will use the green hydrogen. So I've had some experience in working with both the universities and national labs to co-create technologies, if you will. So once you have ability to electrify, and just because the end-use efficiencies of electrical system is so much higher, electrification will happen of a lot of sectors. But the key is going to be resiliency and reliability of electric grid. And so a lot of people are talking about batteries. There's all kinds of batteries being talked about, the lithium ion being the primary front runner. But certainly, I was actually advisor to SECRI. And so we started a whole variety of efforts, not only in lithium ion batteries, but sodium ion, vanadium flow batteries, and Reliance is investing in a liquid metal battery as well. They may have some promise. And obviously, the world will go because that's what the mature technology seems to be. A lot of people are looking at hydrogen itself as a storage, especially when you have excess renewable energy, you can electrolyze water and store hydrogen. I'll convince you later on that I'm going to talk about renewable oil. Whether I make a renewable oil from a waste, organic material like municipal solid waste, or from my really cutting edge project called Algae to Oil, that the energy that I can make store in a hydrocarbon, in a renewable hydrocarbon or renewable oil, has a much higher capacity and is much cheaper than any of these batteries. Because oil is nothing but a battery from many aspects, and I'll convince you why it could be a better option. So anyway, let me begin with one of the technologies that we are quite confident that we will commercialize. This is related to converting organic waste, whether it's a dairy waste or municipal solid waste or agri waste even, and converting that using a catalytic hydrothermal liquefaction. Again, many people in the world are working on a thermal hydrothermal liquefaction. We develop a catalytic system. And actually, we developed this first to convert algae, but I can use that same system with a minor tweaking on any organic material. And the challenge here is not the technology. The challenge here is more of aggregation of the feedstock and bringing it a relatively assured basis, both in terms of volumes and the cost, so that whatever plant investment we make can actually use the feedstock. And we also have technologies to convert that bio crude to, say, aviation fuel, because I don't see aviation getting into electrification anytime down the road. So certainly the technology that was developed for algae is same that I can use for municipal solid waste, other agri waste. The top chart shows the flow chart, so there is some minor pre-processing, and then we essentially go through a catalytic reactor and the simple product separation, and you make a biocrude. You can use the biocrude and you burn it to make power if you choose to, because that way you can make electricity if you want to, or you can upgrade it to make transportation fuels. The scale of the pilot plant is fairly large, as you can see from the photograph on the left, and the reactor system is again something we develop in-house along with our catalyst. It's a catalytic system. And the beauty of this is that it is much better in terms of what it can do. But before I talk about the competitive analysis, since I did a lot of work in my previous company on the fundamentals of kinetics at a molecular level. In fact, we developed the kinetics for the entire crude oil, where the crude oil was characterized at a molecular level, so millions of species, and a very complex kinetics. So we applied the same sort of a knowledge where we can take any organic material and predict the product quality as well as the product yield. And one of the important things on the top right-hand chart is that most of the thermal processes, the crude you make has significant amount of oxygen. But since I use the catalyst in this hydrothermal process, we actually deoxygenate at the same time. So it increases the calorific value and it reduces the upgradation cost further in the refinery. And if you look at the end drop-in fuel that we can make from such a biocrude, one of the beauty is that almost 75% of the energy content of the feed is retained in the product. And the net CO2 reduction is, on a end-to-end basis is almost 86%. So it's again another carbon neutral technology of great significance, and you can convert the waste to wealth. Now, just to put it in perspective, how do we compete compared to many other technologies being pursued? So there are many different organic feedstock as shown on the left-hand side of this chart. Certainly people are burning it today to make power, probably the least effective ways to convert the energy of the feed to energy for end use. There's a lot of emphasis on ethanol, especially, India has been investing in 2G ethanol. Shell has this catalytic pyrolysis. So if you look at the overall energy of the feed to energy of the product, right? There's a lot of emphasis in India also on a biogas. But if you look at the efficiency of overall thermal efficiency of feed to product, it's nowhere close to what we can do with ARC at HTL. So we're at 75%, and the best that you can achieve with other technologies around 55%. So this is a technology is a must in from perspective of maximizing utilization of the energy in the feed, energy in the final product. And so let me talk about relative economics. And so what I've done on this chart is that I looked at a bio-CNG 2G ethanol incineration with ARCAT HTL for a 500 tons per day, say, dry paddy straw biomass. And for all these projects, we are looking at 3-year payout. And then looking at, how much product do you make? And what is the capex? And since all this technology is going to require a green premium, there is delta related to the hydrocarbon business. And that in this chart is subsidy. So if you look at the subsidy part, the subsidy for the ARCAT HTL is the lowest in terms of cents for million joules as shown here, compared to any other technology. In fact, making ethanol is probably the worst way you can take the biomass energy and convert it to something of fuel quality. Now, certainly the capex intensity is higher for RCAT HTL because it's a high pressure system compared to say bio-CNG, but certainly it's much cheaper than ethanol. So from my perspective, what we don't have today, there are incentives for other technologies, and there is no such incentive for a bio crude that I make. So I have been actually pleading with the government of India that this technology can be utilized. And if you don't want to make end fuel, you can just burn the biofuel to make electricity, because that is still far more cheaper. But what we need is some sort of a biocrude pricing policy. Then this technology can actually be implemented in India at a much rapid rate. Now let me switch gear and talk about CO2. Because CO2 and climate change are one and the same. And so there's a lot of effort going on and trying to monetize CO2, and we've done a lot of work on a whole variety of things. But the one thing I'm really, really proud of is really our algae to oil project. This is one of those things that almost everyone told me it's the most stupid thing to do. But when I looked at the fundamentals, I said this is a fantastic way to understand a couple of things. A, I truly believed from day one that the biology is going to be the future in this century. So I wanted to get into biology. This is one way to get to biology. And second thing was, to me, it was very simple. I'm converting photons to something useful. So I must understand photosynthesis. Those are two areas we actually put a lot of effort that I want to talk to you about. So before I get into A2O, one of the things that I realized that the CO2 that I use to grow algae is not free. Almost everybody said CO2 is almost free. And I realized if I were to put a concentration of a CO2 of any flue gas, I'm looking at anywhere from $40 to $60 a ton of CO2 cost. And that was certainly not bearable for any making oil from algae with sunlight. So my target was $10, just the OPEX. So we developed this new adsorption system. It's better than any amine system in the world, which is the dominant system today. And if you look at our adsorption, desorption way of concentrating CO2, our capture cost a factor of 2 lower than any competing technology today. And certainly this makes it a lot cheaper to feed CO2 to my algae. And obviously this will become a very critical technology as time goes on, when we want to concentrate CO2 from a dilute flue gases. So let me talk about my truly a flagship project. And we did invest in a few startups here and there, and what I learned is what not to do. What I started to realize is that here is a way in which I can convert sunlight, CO2, seawater on a marginal land. And India has a tremendously long coastline, and we have a ingress of salt almost everywhere along the coast. So, and one of my thoughts was I could convert a run of Kutch into a green oil field. And so we decided that we're going to develop every element of this technology, starting from understanding the biology, understanding photosynthesis, understanding how we're going to cultivate it, how we're going to make these ponds run. And probably we're the only guys in the world who are running ponds without crashes on a very, very large scale for more than 2-3 years in a running. And at a 10,000 barrels per day facility, we develop engineering plans that I can make a crude oil purely from sunlight, CO2, seawater on a marginal land at $100 a barrel. Obviously, when everybody says $100 a barrel, they get all really worried because the crude oil prices have been fluctuating. And there's no way, but that is without subsidy. And by the way, you're comparing a fossil crude oil with a renewable crude oil. So I'll show you, if I were to compare it to a solar PV plus battery, how would I compare? But if you look at just the crude oil itself, the biocrude subsidies that are available in the US and Europe, I can make this commercial. And actually many people outside of India, in Europe and the US, are talking to us to see whether we could collaborate and commercialize this technology somewhere else. But let me begin. I'll show you the pilot facility we have at Gagwa. It's one of the world's largest R&D pilot plant to make sunlight to crude oil. And I'll play a video to give you an idea about the scale of this pilot plant.
Our world runs on oil, for fuel, for food, for life. For much of human history, we have relied only on 3 sources of oil. plant oils, animal fats, and petroleum to meet all of our needs. Reliance has found a fourth source in the form of a billion-year-old organism, which grows 20 to 30 times faster than food crops and holds the key to solving the world's energy problem sustainably. Algae, the green gold. We are scaling up this technology at Gagwa, near Jamnagar, where Reliance's flagship refinery is located. Given proximity to the refinery and coastline, CO2 and seawater are available in abundance at the site. The solar irradiance is ideal for algae cultivation.
So that gives you a feel for this pilot plant, if you will. Let me come to some technical aspects, and I want to talk about biology of the algae in large scale, non-GMO. But I'll talk about GMO later on because to me it's far more exciting. Anyway, so first thing I told my scientists is that I need to understand photosynthesis. At the end of the day, I'm converting energy of photons to energy in a biomass that I'm then converting to crude oil with ARCAD HTL I talked about. And it was quite clear, if you look at agriculture, the efficiency of a C3 plant like rice is only 3%, and a C4 plant like sugarcane is maybe 5%. And so certainly, if you were to run ponds at those efficiencies, it's never going to be practical. So we wanted to understand the fundamentals of photosynthesis, and actually, as it turns out, when you are using photons to split water and making electrons and forming all this carbon-argon bond, at the biology, it's really all quantum physics, or quantum phenomena. But as an engineer, my point was that, okay, I may not never understand the biology part because we don't even have instruments to measure the rate at which these things happen. But can I actually measure the rate by which I can predict the kinetics so I can have an affordable way to predict CapEx and OpEx and build a better designs, whether they're designs for the ponds or they're designs for the photobioreactors. And the photobioreactors were important to me because I was quite keen. At the end of the day, if I were to do genetically modify, I can do many things. And so, open pond GMO in India is probably getting government approval is impossible. Whereas for a closed photobioreactors, it was not a challenge. So I'll talk a little bit about that. But we achieve photosynthetic efficiency close to 18%. That means energy of the photons to energy in the end product of 18% in some of the systems, which is clearly unheard of. Certainly, the near-term application of understanding of photosynthesis, actually applying it to agriculture and improving productivity of agriculture itself. Now, if you think about the biomass I make as a significantly higher value, and when I make crude oil, I'm actually downgrading its value. You will do this only when the CO2 becomes a real problem and the energy security is an issue. But certainly, if you look at economics, and this is important because the European Union and the US is quite keen on looking at biocrude as an option. And so if you look at the overall efficiency, because there are certain RED 2 targets in the EU, which you get a biofuel credit of $100 a barrel, to be honest. And you have to meet a 67% reduction, which the A2O technology does. And overall cost of $100 is roughly $50 a barrel on CapEx and $50 on OpEx. By the way, it depends upon what is the period on which you're going to depreciate the capital. Here I'm using the Reliance aggressive CapEx depreciation that I want the project to pay off in less than 4 or 5 years. If you go to the US and Europe, the CapEx payout times are like 10 to 15 years. So that would make this thing even cheaper. But anyway, a lot of people outside are interested in this sort of a technology. And by the way, the algae I'm using here has no genetic modification at all. So you can use it anywhere in the world and make a biocrude. So essentially, I'm converting sunlight to renewable energy. Now, certainly, everybody's excited about solar photovoltaic and batteries. And the solar cost for a 1 gigawatt plant without storage is certainly competitive to any other energy source of making electricity at 4 cents a kilowatt hour, for example. But the moment you start adding battery cost, because if you want truly a resiliency and reliability, and once you go off grid, there's no way you can have a solar without a significant amount of storage. And I just chose, looking at the Bill Gates book is suggesting you need several months of storage. I'm saying, okay, let's take a 15 days storage. And if you don't understand, what I'm doing is actually converting photons to a high energy density crude oil. And if you look at the Regone plot, the power density and energy density of oil is significantly higher than anything else. So if you look at the algae to oil I store for 15 days, and I don't want to even make transportation fuel, just burn it as is in a 33% efficient electricity generation. And those are the costs I'm comparing. So if you can see, if you were to fully cost solar plus a large amount of storage, converting those photons to oil and burning them to electricity is far better. Anyway, I mean, if I'm making a high quality crude oil, I might as well convert it to transportation fuel and make it aviation fuel or something like that. But just to give you an idea, but if you understand the fundamentals of photons and how they get converted, you can start understanding where science can help with engineering and economics. That was the idea of presenting this material. Anyway, since the oil business is a pretty risky business, it's very volatile. Another thing I wanted to do was, if I were to live in this VUCA world, I want to make sure that any investments I make, because when we started this program, people are talking about CO2 tax, this, that, and crude oil prices were high and going to be higher. But then there was a period of time some people didn't believe climate change is real. Now we are back and looking at COP26, and people are thinking about getting serious. But who knows what will happen? And as I said, since I convert the CO2 and sunlight, I can make any product I actually want. And especially if I do genetic modifications of algae, I can do whatever I actually want. Because in my mind, future belongs to biology. And so we've invested quite heavily on understanding recombinant DNA technology. We use CRISPR quite a bit to modify microorganisms, whether it's algae, yeast, or E. coli. And then we can convert anything we want to various products. And I'll give you a few examples. So we are focusing on a very high value materials in the beginning. Certainly, if I make a biocrude, I can make bioplastics as well. But I'll talk a couple of examples to show the power of biology. And if you think about India, the protein demand in India is going to grow quite rapidly. India is both protein deficient as well as iron deficient country, because largely a vegetarian food basket. And so certainly, we are making large amounts of protein today, and we have put them in the market for seeding. And our algae-based proteins do meet all the requirements, both regulatory as well as technical. And we make two different products. One is based on a non-GMO, it's essentially a regular algae, and we are calling it as a super protein. And that has gone through a category 5 safe for human consumption approval. But we also genetically modified algae, and we make actually iron-fortified proteins. So these proteins are very similar to what the proteins that Impossible Burger and other companies in the US are making. Obviously, they have raised more than $400, $500 million. I'm doing this at a few crores, if you will. And our proteins are just as effective from an iron-fortified perspective. So although the algae is genetically modified, the product that I make is not. It's essentially like a hemoglobin. And we're actually using the vegetarian source of legumin, and we're expressing those genes in algae to make iron-fortified protein. And so we use a lot of omics and big data technology to, and I'll talk a little bit about connecting genotype to phenotype in the next few charts. But we're doing this, and these are the products we are actually be commercializing with algae first. One of these days, we will make the biocrude in India. Obviously, biocrude may happen somewhere else before. But these are truly a flagship technologies, as I discussed before. Just to give you an example, I'm making a spider silk in my algae. So I'm essentially making a protein by expressing a fairly large gene module with a recombinant algae. And the idea here is that I'm converting CO2, seawater, and sunlight. This is the ultimate in sustainability. I mean, there's nothing more sustainable that you can think about, that I can take these basic raw materials and convert them to various products. You cannot make spider silk by harvesting spiders like the silkworms. And yes, the spider silk is the strongest material known to mankind. And this is the first time anyone in the world has done such a thing with algae. So we're quite excited about bio-inspired smart materials, if you will. So this gives you an example of what we are doing in biology. So let me talk a lot about generic India and AI and few other things. Here's a chart I took from Niti Aayog. The digital technologies are certainly taking off, and everybody's talking about AI. And I'll give you my perspective on what AI is, what we need to do. But certainly Niti Aayog thinks it can add $1 trillion of GDP to Indian economy by 2035, but certainly a very important sector. Now, many of chemical engineers worked in this sort of a field for many years. Now, neural nets were quite common, but we couldn't really build a lot of deep networks because of lack of computing power and availability of data. And what really has changed is really the ability to do backpropagation or tuning, if you will. There's a whole variety of very interesting algorithms available. And I won't bother you, many of you are aware of it. But simply put, from my perspective, this data science and all this stuff requires, because only today we have huge amounts of data. And, whether we can actually use this sort of a tool to discover new way of understanding, certainly people are working on it. And I'm quite optimistic, but I'll tell you what we need to really work on to solve difficult scientific problems using these newer technologies with a much cheaper computing. And certainly it has made a big impact on speech and language recognition, image recognition, things like that. And overall system is nothing but a big loop where you're using data, you're actually putting together the models, essentially input-output models, you're generalizing them. But I guess since I work in genomics and work quite a bit in biology, I started applying these techniques and started to realize if I want to solve the mystery of life, the current existing techniques that are good for pattern recognition are not really good enough for me. I need to do something more refined, more important. And so I'll talk a little bit about that, what we have done and what needs to be done. But these are clearly low-hanging fruits. This is something Indian scientists should actually invest time, because you can harvest information and create new knowledge to create new technologies relatively inexpensively. Obviously, in a Geo Krishi platform, we are applying a lot of these AI tools for giving services to farmers related to weather, or related to connecting markets, or relating to giving them some useful information about the soil, seeds, things like that. But these are really application of known technology, but making it available as a service on a large scale. And certainly that will help. But since we worked on algae, and since we understand something about photosynthesis, understand something about C3, C4 plants, we started to look at how can I broaden this to help agriculture. And as I told you, algae is a C3 plant, just like rice. So what we did is we took a 3,000 rice varieties, their genome. We combined that with all the knowledge we had created about all the omics data on algae. And then we started applying data science tools to say, I basically posed a problem that I need to have a priori knowledge of the genes, because I knew a lot about which genes are overexpressed and underexpressed under different conditions on algae, and also knew something about that for various crops. And so we started looking at how do I do a genotype to phenotype in a predictive way. And we started developing some new types of neural networks, the generalized adversarial networks, and they're showing some promise. So I'm quite confident this will allow us to do a far more targeted breeding, or even GMO one day, to improve the yields of various crops, whether it is crop related to drought resistance, so on and so forth. This is my perspective on whether AI is actually artificial intelligence. To me, it's really augmented intelligence, and I won't bother you with these charts. Where we are today is somewhere about in the middle, what I call is the statistical learning tools. We are nowhere closer to what I would call contextual adaptation. So current generation AI tools are statistically impressive, but individually unreliable. And it all depends upon what data you have. At the end of the day, these tools are nothing but a simple pattern recognition and pattern filling. And from my perspective, AI is still not autonomous. That's the big opportunity. Anyway, if you look at the AI, there are 5 different tribes, and I won't bother you with this, but all of them have something common related to a representation of data, evaluation, and then optimization. And I've been following this Pedro Domingo's work of saying, can I make even better algorithms? Because I'm quite convinced that none of these algorithms are going to help us to solve the mystery of life. And so essentially, we need to improve this whole area of development to solve previously unsolved problems. It's a challenge for some young students to take on and go figure out how do we do better algorithm development for biology, if you will. And obviously, it will apply to many other things. So let me switch gear. Reliance, from my perspective, in the last 10 years, the capability we have built is probably poised to integrate all 3 domains of biology, digital technologies, and physical to start actually playing on the frontiers of the 4th industrial revolution. So I'm quite hopeful something useful will come out. So let me talk a little bit about the education system, and I'll kind of run fast because maybe I'm running a little bit behind. And these are personal views, so take them as they are. So the academia-industry expectations is a symbiotic relationship. Academia creates the graduates who are absorbed by us. And obviously, industry has a lot of hard problems, and we're looking for experts in academia who can focus on basic science to help us unravel the scientific basis on which we can build technologies. So certainly we need to focus on, my perspective, fundamental sciences that can meet the societal needs. And I won't bother you about the right-hand chart. Essentially shows roles and responsibility of the two sides and how we have to work together. And the partnership is a key. And certainly without an alignment, a strategy, and a government policy support, it will be hard-pressed to solve some of the complex societal problems where industry, I'm talking about private industry, and the academia can play an important role. Now, there are several macro problems in India's education system, and Professor Joshi is quite aware of them, and he's probably the most knowledgeable on how to solve some of these problems at the grassroots level. So I listed a few of them. Certainly, we have a problem of shortage of teachers. Our skills are not really aligned from my perspective of the fourth industrial revolution. We really don't teach our students to think on their own. And they are not necessarily given skills. We don't have the liberal education that has the foundations of beyond the technical skills and include the art, humanities, and social science in an integrated way to address societal problems. Certainly, we have youth with passion. We have to add some compassion to them. We have to teach them values and lifelong learning and societal skills so they could be more productive. Because most of the students I hired, for example, we need to retrain them in various basic skills. Now, if you look at the higher education system, we don't look at education as a knowledge. We don't teach students to be creative on their own. In fact, my experience has been if I hire a smart undergraduate, he's far more productive than a PhD student. Because many times the PhDs are actually lacking ability to, I'm making a very general statement. I'm sure there are some smart PhDs as well. I'm talking about average on the broad basis. They are more about taking somebody's advice and just doing things rather than saying, okay, here I give you a problem, go figure out how to solve it. And one thing I found is that most of our students really didn't know a big understanding about who are the key leaders from an R&D perspective in their own field. And so I think they need to be given a different way of looking at things. Should be given open-ended problems and no support at all. Let them solve it on their own, let them struggle. That way they will become more creative and be able to solve real problems. So my perspective is a lot of wealth of information, but it creates a poverty of attention. That is my perception on this. I may be wrong, things may be improving, but there's certainly a room for further improvement. Certainly most of them need some sort of apprenticeship for them to be productive, and that is something one could worth thinking about. Now, I guess there's one slide I put together on way I look at education and way we teach today. In my opinion, in a lot of ways, our engineering hasn't changed since 70s probably when I went to school. Maybe there are a few tweaking here and there, but nothing dramatic has changed. And so my perception on this is that we need to educate students for the future, not on our past. I mean, we should tell them the basic sciences, we should tell them the fundamentals, but we should give them tools about how to solve future problems, which even we don't know what they would be. So they need to be curious about, they need to be proactive about learning, they need to be able to collaboratively solve problems with multidisciplinary approach. And so we are entering an on-demand society, and learning is essentially going to be what, when, and where in real time. So thirdly, we need to think about how we're going to utilize these current tools and offer ability for the students to learn and relearn continuously. And so here is my view of looking at the world. And since I talked about VUCA before, in terms of a business being volatile, uncertain, complex, in terms of the demand of what I expect from the students is a vision, understanding, clarity, and agility. And I won't bother you with this whole aspect of things I've listed on the right-hand side. But the key summary is nothing but learning to adopt, a lifelong learning, ability to learn and learn new things. And in my perspective, if you make the students fearless, life will become limitless. So the bottom line is you got to be able to think on your own, challenge the status quo, create something new. And sometimes I tell, you start unknown and finish unforgettable. I'll talk about this again later. Anyway, in Reliance, since we were talking about now Geo Institute and the way we look at the leadership development, I put one simple chart. And how do we create new business leaders? And simple, there are whole aspects which are on the left-hand side about 21st century skills, which are related to literacy, critical thinking, curiosity, leadership, so on and so forth. And some of them are getting integrated into the way we are thinking about the Geo Institute. But the important thing is that one needs to adapt faster than anyone else. And so there has to be there should be no latency between the thought and the action. And that's, if your leaders can think and act, probably will have done something useful. So let me talk a little bit about Geo Institute, because Mr. Ambani has committed significant amount of resources in creating the next generation institute like MIT or Stanford here in India. And essentially it's going to be a force multiplier to help India leapfrog in its growth for education, higher education as well. And so there are several pillars, and I won't bother you with the details, but essentially it will be an R&D along with the education. It will have incubators and startup and ability of industry and various different disciplines to work together. It will be built on the 21st century digital backbone. And it will be actually an integrated global economic hub. So there will be a whole variety of things beyond just education and research and innovation parks and incubators. Because at the end of the day, education and employment are the two sides of the same coin. And so the whole idea here is that if we can create a world-class institute here in India near Mumbai that can bring in the best of minds together, perhaps we can do a lot better in terms of creating future leaders, both technical as well as business. So now let me come back and talk about the Indian economy and talk about what's it we need to do. And I gave a lot of perspective on the technical aspects. Let me talk about some non-technical aspects as well. Now, if I look at, and by the way, this graph is something we had put together a few years back, and I just take a proxy as an energy demand as a function of GDP per capita, and took the data from last 200 years from various countries. And this red line just shows how the different economies evolve once the industrialization and the personal mobility starts, to urbanization happens, to like the OECD countries, where essentially they have outsourced manufacturing. It's all nothing but a economy driven by the intellectual capabilities. So if I look at India and compare it to China and USA, by the way, China has followed the same trajectory, essentially the same as what the rich countries have done. And if you look at India is still on the bottom left. Certainly, if we follow the same trajectory, we'll exhaust the resources of the earth. So probably we need to do something better than that. But anyway, the real challenge is that our employment is huge in agriculture, which is not that productive. Our industrial manufacturing sector is really not that strong. It's not as competitive, except for a few companies. And I'll talk a little bit about that. And so basically, we need a renaissance in all sectors and improve performance everywhere. And if I look at the major challenges, there's a big gap between the productivity compared to the other organized countries. Things are improving, don't get me wrong. But the majority of the working India is still in unorganized sector. It is still not fully skilled. Our education, if you look at compared to our aspiration, lags behind. And certainly, we have too many small companies, not enough large companies to make a big dent. And so, we are somehow trapped into the middle income trap. And there's a Vijay Kelkar, a fantastic book, economist, if you will, as it kind of talks about some of the challenges. And although we talk about $5 trillion economy, and we will achieve that just because of sheer population, but the real challenge to uplift the entire population is actually increasing GDP per capita. Now, I guess I won't bore you, but our Atmanirbhar Bharat and the 5 pillars of economy are here, and then certainly the reforms that are going on, we will do a lot better in the future. But I guess if I think about some of the formalization that has to happen, some of the urbanization that will continue, some of the financialization that has to happen in terms of the availability of credit, amount of debt that we use to create, and how do you create more human capital to make a much stronger industrial base. So there are several things we need to do to upgrade and repair. I mean, India is doing a lot better than before, and certainly some of the government policies which are listed here are in the right direction. Some of them could be accelerated. I took this from Jhunjhunwala, if you will. And so I won't bother you with this. So a lot of things are happening, but the main thing is about government getting out of non-critical sectors. And so there will be divestments and the privatization that will improve the efficiency. And certainly, this confluence of reforms will bring in more capital flows, and the economy would improve. So we're on the right track. Certainly, the challenge is how do you make the growth more equitable? Because if I look at the prosperity that has happened in India, and the prosperity is inequality twin, as you can see from the data on the top right part, and some of the supply side inequality and the demand side inequalities, the reason between the rural and urban divide are kind of known. But certainly the aspect is that we need to give equality in access despite income inequality. And in my perspective, Indian inventions are just as critical as innovations. I'll talk a little bit about that in a couple of minutes. But we have to invent and implement our own technologies to solve these pressing problems. Certainly, urbanization will continue, and I'm hoping, and I was really surprised by the Economist data that some of the growth and the world ranking of our Indian cities like Malappuram to Surat, the mid-sized cities are growing fast, much faster than, and obviously, I suspect for growth to be equitable, we need to give greater emphasis on these smaller cities to urbanize and create more clusters of knowledge and industry and incubators closer to them. So it's a more equitable growth all across. In terms of data and in terms of, I would say, telecom services, Geo has done a fantastic job. In fact, Geo has outpaced the world in terms of data availability and the cost at which it is available. So certainly the access to data is not an issue anymore. But certainly a way to create a more equitable growth is to grow all parts of India. No matter what we look at agricultural sector, urbanization will happen, because without that, the economy will not take off. And certainly we need to think about how do we make it work more efficiently. Now, I guess I just took this slide from the Government of India, Vigyan Se Vikas. Certainly, there are a lot of schemes being discussed. Although the COVID has had an impact on our GDP, I think the $5 trillion target hasn't changed for 2025. And most importantly, the V-shaped recovery that we expect this year certainly will get us to probably a double-digit growth. So from my perspective, the technical and business communities have a historic opportunity to help India leapfrog. We're on the right track. Now, if I look at, again, the digital landscape in India is doing extremely well. I mean, some of the cities like Bangalore, they have become hubs for a startup community. And, so I think certainly the progress is happening. And, we will achieve this $1 trillion economy addition through digital technologies. But most of the technologies that are developed are really fast follower. We're just customizing what is done somewhere else for the Indian market. And don't get me wrong, that's okay. Chinese application ban will also help. But the many incubator starts and the whole activity of big entrepreneurship is great. And so certainly we need to build on this. There's a lot of new unicorns being born, and there's tremendous emphasis on valuation. Hopefully, as they provide services, the value will come, not just the valuation, if you will. And so I think, I'm quite optimistic, but the whole key is that the success in a digital startup, can it be applied to other technologies? Because it's not clear to me. Because if you look at different industries, and here's kind of a chart in a simple way to understand, the technology development rate and technology, most importantly, deployment rate are very different. If we look at tech companies, it doesn't take a lot of money to develop something. And it's a lot faster to deploy to millions of customers with the one click of a button. That is not the case for, say, energy industry. So when you look at the transition to new energy, these are decade type of things to change because of irreversible nature of investment, very high capital intensity. So one has to be careful. Now, would the startups change the whole ecosystem of energy? They may create something new, but they'll need some help from the really big, strong players to commercialize and deploy at a rate at which it can make a big dent. Now, the biotech is somewhere in between, and this is really a big opportunity because if I look at what's happening on the west coast of California and the valuation some of these, synthetic biology companies are getting, they're getting valuations close to what the tech companies get, even though they need some more investment. But something to think about, and something the synthetic biology should take off in India, because there's a big opportunity to solve many problems, whether they are related to health, related to agriculture, related to new materials. So it's a big opportunity for students to think about synthetic biology culture, way to look at it. Now, since I came back to India after 40 years in the US, I'll give you my perspective and what are our challenges. And these are my personal perspective, by the way, so I may be completely wrong. Now, if I look at India, I talked about before, the high productivity, the countries which are leading, there are two important elements that come out. A, the productivity of workforce is very high. But second thing is that they implement their own inventions. They may innovate something, but they do implement what they invent. Now, India has achieved a third position in papers published, and I get a lot of remarks from my colleagues in the academia saying, hey, India is doing so great. But if I look at our innovation index, it's still 52nd. And there was a fantastic paper written by a professor at Indian Institute of Science talking about, we write a lot of papers. And I'm talking about, there are a few exceptional people, certainly some maybe in the audience. I know for sure Professor J.B. Joshi is very prolific and at a cutting edge. But on an average, the Indian publications are at 50 to 70% of the world standards, if you will. And the interesting thing is that if I just look at the public R&D expenditure in India, is 7th in the world, is more than the countries like Israel or Sweden, UK, Canada, but we're not as productive. And part of the challenge from my perspective is that we publish a lot. Dr. Mashelkar talked about patenting, so moving from publish or perish to patent to prosper, some things change in CSR labs. But patenting is not enough. You got to take those patents and convert them to technology and implement. And this is where the robust private-public partnerships are needed, because the translational R&D of converting those ideas into a steel on the ground is where we have not done well, something we absolutely must improve. Now, I won't bore you here. There's a bunch of data. I mean, if I look at just China, our neighbor, what did they do? I mean, Mr. Deng did something interesting. I mean, he spent an awful lot of money on education in terms of R&D, building big centers, invested heavily in industry. They copied in the beginning, but they actually improved. And today, if I look at where China is, people expect them to lead the world in artificial intelligence and biotechnology, key pillars of the fourth industrial revolution. And certainly, we need to convert our inventions to practical applications. There are some points are written here when I talk to CSR, I'm talking about, what are the national priorities and how should we reallocate some of our spending and what should we do. But there are two important elements. One is the translational R&D, and second is the private sector has to play an important role. Because from my perspective, the major issues of indigenous technology development deployment are summed up here. Our R&D spend in the private sector is still low. We don't have expertise in scale up when it comes to putting $1 billion plants. And certainly we build certain capability in Reliance, and I'm confident as our balance sheet gets stronger, we will implement some of our first to the world technologies. And we wouldn't be asking questions such as, has it been done before? Will it work? Can I get some validation from external experts? That was okay 20, 30 years ago. Today, we should be bold and strong enough to say we are willing to risk on our own technology and commercialize them. And so those are some of our challenges. And the indigenous technologies absolutely had to be the world class. They need to compete with the world's best. Anyway, so how can we improve? Again, there are a whole bunch of ideas. Some things are working well, but if I look at some other countries, government spent quite a bit of money early on from TRL to TRL5. China spends quite a bit of money on TRL5 to 9. My opinion is that the Indian private industry is not going to be able to do it on its own in the near term, so government will have to play a role. And this is where the public-private partnerships become important. Some of the mission-oriented projects, continuing to give some R&D tax credit, is something that Indian government has to change some policies, create some mission-oriented large-scale projects, and focus on a few critical projects rather than spending money on a whole variety of things. So this is something we need to have a change in the mindset, both in the society, academia, bureaucracy, policy. And these are my personal views, by the way. I may be wrong, but this is just my perspective, just looking at last 10 years of my being here and working on a whole variety of fronts, trying to create something leading in the world. Certainly, we had done well in India in the past when nothing was available. So we are quite capable of doing it. We just need to apply it, and we need to apply it in a mission mode. And the scientific minds in India will have to come together with the Indian industry for help India achieve global leadership. I don't think either sector alone can do it. So anyway, the last couple of slides. I mean, some of our industries are done well in what I call economies of scale and economies of scope, and Reliance is certainly an example. We are getting on, these economies are learning. So, benefiting from doing things smarter, not just larger and bigger. And, ability to have a digital connectivity and a boundaryless world today. What we need to do is really extract the value of this collective connected ingenuity. And obviously, to get the value and the nuggets out of knowledge that exists worldwide, we absolutely must have a strong basic research. We need to connect inventors to investors. And most importantly, we need to have ample supply of risk capital. Risk capital may come from the government of India in the beginning for large projects, mission-oriented projects. Obviously, the industry is spending risk capital on a lot of startups. So a lot of good things are happening. So I'm quite optimistic, but here's an opportunity for us to exploit it and be a leader in the fourth industrial revolution by being smart and being able to connect and extract the value where it matters from the noise. Now, I do work with the national labs quite actively and universities, but many times I feel like it's like a baton. I work with them and they give me something, and I always worry that the baton may get dropped in this process. In this public-private partnership, you need a much closer integration, just like this Kuchipudi of Reddy's. So it needs to be end-to-end engagement, all the way from a concept to commercialization. You just can't just hand off and just move on. And I took this bottom part from Dr. Michelker. The bottom left chart shows that there's no gate, but the sheep is still following. So we need to actually snap out of this mindset that we're going to be fast followers. To do a true leadership skills, we need to break away from the flock, take some risk. It's kind of interesting. Only in India, I've heard the expression such as, if someone else can do it, first let them do it. If no one can do it, why should I do it? And I always feel if it's a problem is important enough, if nobody has done it, we should absolutely must do it. And so I tell my staff, when you get knocked down, get up and get going again. And, I always talk about, this is my last slide, by the way. There's a lot of talk about innovation. There's all variety of innovation, depending on who you talk to. From my mind, actually, inventions matter more. Innovations can make money on somebody else's invention. That's great to get going. But why not invent in India before we start making in India? And that will help us to boost the capability and ability to do complex problems for a long term, not just solve some short-term problems. So, the I in India should be inventions along with innovations. But most importantly, it's implementation that really matters. So, business and academia can work together. And certainly an opportunity to implement Indian inventions, innovations, to meet the aspirational needs of Indian large population to climb the ladder of prosperity. The most important thing, if you look at in the Mahatma Gandhi's quote that's at the bottom, he talks about inventions. So it's really inventions to me are far more important because that shows I want to create something that is first to the world. And if you don't have that aspiration, you don't have that inclination, you'll always remain fast follower. So anyway, those are my thoughts, and those are my personal thoughts, by the way. In no way it reflects Reliance management views. And it's quite clear that some of my views may be somewhat radical. But I guess unless you stretch the boundaries, in my mind, the value is always across the unknown. So you got to challenge the status quo. You need to talk about, in a polite way. I'm not saying, in any way that is disrespectful. I mean, one has to show humility and has to accept multiple perspectives. But this is the only way we can prosper. So my simple message to young people is to start something unknown and finish something unforgettable. There'll be bumps up and down, but you will go figure out on your own how to solve them. So go discover, go develop, deploy, and deliver value at the end of the day. Because we're entering the era of cognification. And there are a lot of things that are going to happen that you even don't know how they would evolve. And if your mind is not prepared and agile, you'll be left behind. So anyway, this is my perspective, and it is my personal perspective, so take it as is, it may be. And it's quite clear that I may not know the Indian education system, the innovation system, and R&D system, since I've been here only 10 years and too busy trying to build a capability in Reliance and not really as active as I should be. So thank you again. I probably took a lot longer, but hope hopefully we got something useful out of it.
Yeah, thank you very much for a wonderful, lucid manner. Very nice talk. I think many important points you have touched, many important questions you have raised. So I hope our students and faculty members will take up some kind of, your points to progress in future. So with that, I ask.
We will find out whether Professor Joshi and Professor Grover have.
Yeah, I will ask that. Professor Joshi, do you have any question to put up or any?
Grover.
Yes.
Yeah, please.
Just outstanding lecture. Just outstanding.
Okay.
I'm truly impressed.
JB Joshi taught me several courses and I learned something fundamental at UDCT. I must thank him for all the wonderful ideas he planted when we were young.
Yeah. Thank you. The strengths and limitations of academia and industry are known, I think, and the answers are also known. My view has been the leaders of academia and leaders of industry, they should meet more frequently, and there are so many opportunities, and I agree with you that the problem which is selected should be comprehensive from start to finish. We are capable, but we are not coming together and selecting and committing on that. I have a whole lecture built around the sentence which I said, but definitely we have capabilities and we can do it together. Just come together and whatever is required. I don't think a lot of money is required, a lot of facilities are required. Whatever is already there, we can do something. That is my view.
No, I agree with you, but I mean, to me, that is necessary but not sufficient. Because we have to focus on the future and we need to do some big things, big investments, which require big risks. And I think those are the things which probably we need to focus on, figure out how do we collectively do it. I mean, I'm sure we do have talent. We have shown it before when nothing was available, like space and nuclear, we did it. So we can do it in other sectors as well. It just needs a concerted effort of all the stakeholders and bring them together and put them mission-oriented projects.
Correct.
Okay, thank you. Professor Grover, do you want to say something?
Yes. First of all, I enjoyed this lecture, Dr. Sapre. It was an extremely interesting lecture. And the many ideas which you expressed, I have been myself articulating similar ideas. And you talked about boundaryless integration of institutions. I've been using the word clustering of institutions as a similar concept. And let me say that setting up of Homi Bhabha National Institute as a deemed to be university was a step in clustering various DI institutions and improving
Something wrong?
I think maybe one can talk in detail sometime on this aspect. You touched upon briefly on TRL1 to TRL5. What I find is in most of the research which is being done in our academia, barring the few top institutions, is confined to only TRL1. Research is done, paper published, and filed. You have to learn to move to beyond TRL1, and a lot can be done in academic institutions. And I'm very happy to note that many institutions, ICT is one of them, which are moving beyond TRL1 and delivering a lot. But your message is very clear, boundaryless integration of institution, that is the need of the hour, then only we can move forward. Thank you very much for this talk.
No, thank you for your encouragement. I appreciate it.
Yeah, our VC has some points to say. Yeah, you want to say?
Dr. Sapre, I just want to ask a few questions. But before that, I want to really thank you for a very, very enlightening lecture, because as you cautioned us in the beginning, it was a whirlwind tour of ideas. So you have flooded us with so many ideas that I'm tempted to think that we need another interactive session with you, maybe at HBNI, without the boundaries of time, in the formal
Yeah,
format of webinar, more
I'll be,
informal discussion with students and faculty. That
I'll
will
be
be
happy to.
useful to trigger many of them.
I'll be happy to contribute because I try to cover many areas, and actually we've done a lot of other work that I have not talked about at all. So,
Yes,
you know, I
yes.
mean, I do have
One
passion and
is about
energy
work.
to discuss. So, I'm available at any time.
Yes, because at HBNI we have several thousand students, and many of them work on why many? Almost all of them work on cutting edge science and technology. The question is how to trigger them into becoming partners in national development and taking up problems that can really get translated to nationally important products. So that interaction with people like you would be of great help, and we would look forward to that. I have just one or two more specific questions. You rightly mentioned in one of your slides about how in higher education the apprenticeship should be a mandatory part. I fully agree with you, and I think it has been articulated also in the national education policy. But my more specific question is, what is the kind of path being taken by Reliance in this regard? Do you offer apprenticeship to higher education institutions? How do you practice this?
Yeah, we do actually. You know, we have a lot of not why just higher education, also at the undergraduate level. For summer, we offer 3 month both in our plants as well as in our R&D facilities and engineering centers. Even a lot of the graduate students from Institute of Science or IITs, even some from ICT have joined us. It's more, I mean, this is like a hit and a miss. You know, so some professor writes to us and they recommend. So I don't think we have done a good job ourselves in publicizing it or actively promoted it, if you will, because it's more based on. But I would say, every year I must take about 10 to 12 students in variety of our projects, which are started by our R&D leaders, and then they ask for, we're looking for people, and then our HR goes finds them.
That's right. Because as I see it, many educational institutions, particularly higher education institutions, have a formal mechanism at the end of the academic program for just for placement. They will call industries at that time, offer their students for placement. But more important, probably, as you said, is a continuous program of interaction with the industry, where the students are allowed to go from the higher education institution to the industry and learn things on the field and industrial research aspects, etc. This can be formalized between industry and higher education.
If you have some ideas on formalization, because we have not done as good job as perhaps we should have in formalizing some of these. They're like ad hoc person-to-person contact basis. I mean, it's not that bad. I mean, our HR goes out and talks about it, but probably we're not done as active promotion. I mean, the part of the challenge is nobody thinks Reliance is doing anything in research, right? So, unless I talk about certain things, how would you know that what the hell are we working on? You know what I mean? I mean, most people would not think, most people, rightly so, we're a big conglomerate and industrial house, a huge manufacturing operations, or manufacturing others are well known. And we are very young. No, I mean, we didn't start R&D till about 12 years ago when I joined, and first 2-3 years took us to just hire people. I mean, when I joined, I just collected some 100 people who thought they were technical, right? We built an organization pretty close to, like, if you look at the research engineering, 1,500 people. We got huge labs that we built. So it took me a while to build some facilities, focus on some, like I gave you my philosophical framework of how to build capability. But if I look back in my last 10 years, I mean, this is like what I presented was a small scorecard of what we are able to do in India. It has more to do with India and the ability that we can do it ourselves, to show that, let's not be afraid to do something first to the world and commercialize it. I mean, that's the whole idea. And, when many people come and tell me, don't do this because it's stupid, then I get more involved because, I don't take an answer without me internalizing saying it is not possible. And if it is not possible, then I need to understand why it is not possible. And algae oil is a perfect example. If we had not taken that, we would not have gotten serious about photosynthesis or for synthesis, about the genetic modifications. And to me, those are key technologies, because when the climate change affects agriculture, you need to understand both of these at a fundamental level. Otherwise, our food and food security itself will become a challenge. So forget about making oil. The ability to learn something new that you can apply to many different diverse fields, from making new materials to proteins to pharmaceuticals, even oil, if you will, to me was important enough. And I was not deterred by many people saying, no, don't do it.
Yes,
And it is,
your
just because somebody
idea
else hasn't done it doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. If it is important enough, you should do it.
Your idea of algae to oil is indeed really fascinating, and I'm sure it will be a great hit. In fact, when I used to be younger and used to talk to college students, some of the unsolved, rather most should the path-breaking kind of things included such a conversion of solar energy to oil or some useful compounds. Another one was, for example, whether you can create artificial blood, which can be used, which is a very, very important constituent later on.
On the artificial blood, a lot of developments which have already taken place, right? I mean, I think you have to understand, when I joined my previous company, ExxonMobil, in research, people are working on converting oil to food because they thought there'll be food shortage and they should convert oil to food, right? So, when I thought about this, saying if you can convert oil to food, why can I, obviously I can convert food to oil. It's all interchangeable, right? But at the end of the day, it's a basic reaction chemistry. You got to understand at the level at which the biology is nothing but a complex chemistry. It's just that the genes monkey around the chemistry. Now, the regular chemistry doesn't have genes to change your pathways. Whereas in biology, the pathways change in response to many factors. So anyway, sorry about this, but I guess to me, this century is really biology, and understanding the genetic makeup and mystery of life and applying data sciences is a rich area for research that can bring big dividends in many ways. I mean, some of the problem, today we're trying to do the same materials that are available by other means. The real beauty is that you can make things that are not that you can do by conventional ways at all. And those are the ways where you can make a big difference.
Yes, you mentioned a very important point. Suppose someone, an HR or someone from Reliance Industries does not speak out in public about research, how will a common man think that Reliance also does research? But I have a complementary point to make. This is the same thing which we find in probably higher education institutions, including our institutions, that if a person in our institution is not exposed to the research problems which are so exciting to industry, how will he know that he can contribute to industry? It is very common for an MSc student to start looking for a bank job or IT job, but that's all he knows. But if he knows how he can contribute to an industry by involving in research, by interactions between educational institutions and industry, I am sure that many more brilliant minds will go to industry in future for research. So, in fact, there is a question asked by one of our participants.
I think let's be honest about it. I mean, Indian industry doing a lot of R&D is a more recent phenomenon. No, I mean, obviously, some of the small-scale industry did a great R&D work. Like, I know for sure, UDCT works with many companies, but they're trying to solve, I would say, very practical problems of immediate nature, and maybe some breakthrough projects. Like Garda Chemicals and others have certainly did fantastic things of research. But what I meant is that the large industrial houses doing a fairly comprehensive R&D is relatively new, I suspect. I may be wrong, but at least from my perspective, especially in the high capital intensive industry, right? I mean, the industry is like, pharma has done well, but I'm not so sure whether we can call it cutting edge, because still bringing APIs from China to make our finished products, right? So what I meant is that the research is going on, but maybe not at the level at which it could be.
Yes. So one of the participants, Mr. Vineet Menon, has put a similar question on similar lines. For example, Department of Atomic Energy and Reliance Industries Limited can be seen to be in far different domains, which is not really true. Because in fact, in your presentation also, you mentioned the importance of nuclear energy as a very green form of energy in the years to come. So question he is asking is, what kind of joint activity, collaboration, whatever you could think of in the domain of energy, particularly nuclear energy between TAE and RIL, That is,
Actually,
that's a
actually,
question which is being.
actually, Reliance has been involved with the breakthrough energy ventures and some of these, new small-scale nuclear reactors from the waste spent fuel, if you will. So when investing in this sort of area in startups in other parts of the world, I think one of the challenges we have is that why can we invest here in India itself? And that's maybe part of the challenges that we haven't had an exchange of ideas or ways in which they could be making more appealing to the funders.
One more.
Because see, the space and the nuclear has always been the domain of government of India, right? I mean, that's certain industries the government absolutely need to keep control. But many other things, probably as the government is divesting interest, will become more productive and will have more research of its own, things like that. So today on a nuclear side, I mean, there could be a conversation. I'm not actively involved myself, but there are others in the Reliance who are looking at, but they're looking at quite a bit of some of the startups in other parts of the world who are working on new ways of which you could have a safer, smaller, more reliable nuclear reactors. And I'm sure you know, I mean, some of the other countries are doing work. I mean, even I was flabbergasted when Argentina has some small-scale reactors they are commercializing, which was not known to me until recently. So,
Professor Grover wants to make
Yeah,
a point.
Professor Grover has a question. Yeah.
One
Yes,
question with regard to use of biomass or maybe stubble the way we have in the north for energy generation. One issue which always comes up is transporting this stubble to the place where it can be used, and that becomes a process which is highly expensive and it reduces the economic viability of any such process. Do you envisage that some stage we will have some plants which are small, they can be distributed over a wide area such that the cost of transportation is not very high and one can really make them viable?
actually, I did a lot of work. And one of the first things we did is when I started looking at biomass, we did a grassroots work at a village level to taluka level in at least all the states around our plants. So I went all the way from Haryana, Punjab, Gujarat, UP, MP, down south. So we did work at every village in taluka to the district level to figure out what the costs were of the biomass. Actually, did pilots, because I wanted to figure out, because you can't figure out this cost by looking at reports, and you have to actually collect material, aggregate it, store it. The challenge is the biomass is not available the entire year, right? I mean, you also have to store it. You have to aggregate it. Today we are doing that for all our plants where we are putting biomass in our boilers and gasifiers and things like that. So we're doing it today, right? The interesting thing I found was, I mean, with the Indian network of roads and everything, obviously the radius on which I can collect cost effectively is smaller. But the most fundamental understanding I got was that no matter how I looked at it, it was same $50 to $70 a ton in the US or Europe. It was no different in India. It just happened to have a less material. And if I improve the infrastructure, I could improve the radius further. And the cost was not just aggregating, but you have to densify it so I can transport it. You have to remove the water. And how do you do a cheaper solar drying and store it locally? So then we also went into a business models because there's no way a company like Reliance could get into this. I was trying to do this for Jatropa as well. In fact, I could talk about my Jatropa story because I did some phenomenal biology in Jatropa and made it viable. That's the technical aspect. It turned out to be actually the commercial aspect of how would everybody in the value chain will make money, and a guaranteed money, because see, a company like Reliance or any industry would not put up money unless you guarantee me two things. One is the price and second is the volumes, right? And so we developed the business models. It actually turned out to be just like Amul does on a dairy for, some cooperative models where you have a local entrepreneurs take charge, okay? And then you put a proper framework of business where everybody wins. It can be done. The only thing was the incentives were not there in the past, whether it is climate change or whether it is agroeconomy, but they are there today. So I think it will happen. Now, my biomass gasification, the whole idea came about because we were trying to do this gasification for our coal and pet coke, right? And we had this idea of heterogenizing the homogeneous catalyst. You know what I mean? And I wanted to retire this thermal process. So we did that technically because the technical was very complex. I mean, nobody has worked on a solid chemistry where a catalyst migrates and come back. You know what I mean? So that's what we did. It took a long time for us to do that. And then to demonstrate it, that what happens in a small lab scale, I can do it in a 6-story building pilot plant, right? So now we feel quite confident. But the challenge for our business is still the same. How am I going to guarantee them the feedstock cost and a price in areas where we have not done enough work? So that's what we had to work on. And that's where actually the public-private partnership could help, because the government of India could help us, understand about everything about agriculture and what's going on, right? I mean, Reliance, if I were to say I want to put up a plant in agricultural places, I need some partners. I cannot do it on my own. And this is where the public-private partnership would help. So some of it turns out to be not technical at all. It turns out to be a business model, and how do you create value for every participant who feels there's equitable returns.
Okay, one Professor Subhabrato Mojumdar from SINP wants to interact. Professor Mojumdar, are you there?
Yes, I am. Hi, Dr. Sapre. It was a very nice talk. Can you hear me?
Yeah, sure.
Oh, okay. So, I was not completely familiar with the research and development activities in Reliance. So I was more concerned about the Reliance Life Sciences, the biopharma division of the Reliance. I was just wondering, just like in US or any other countries, do you have any like material transfers agreement where somebody who is working in an academic lab trying to develop technology can access the Reliance materials for studies? I mean, just out of curiosity.
Actually, I do that for I'm on the hydrocarbon part of the business.
Right.
So Reliance Life Sciences is an independent entity, and KV Subramaniam leads it. They're doing a lot of really good work. In fact, a lot of the biologists that I got, see what happened was I hired a lot of people from the US, Indian students, PhDs and others, en masse to start my A2O program. And so a lot of them are just going to Reliance Life Sciences because they have a lot of immediate applications in pharma and many other things. They started their work with stem cell research now, but today they're doing a lot of work in, I think they're also getting into now vaccines as well. So they're doing a lot of good work, to be honest with you. And I'm sure like we have agreements with the chemical companies or universities on material transfer. They must have something similar. I'm not familiar myself, but you can write to KV Subramaniam and then he'll let you know. But they're doing a lot of good work, by the way.
Okay.
And they're doing a lot of work on biosimilars. I mean, that's where they're making.
I think that's the question
that
I was going to ask you in that regard, because I looked at the product pipeline of Reliance, and I was a bit concerned. Like I was a bit puzzled because you mentioned about the global leadership, but for some reason it seems that the Reliance Life Sciences is they have a lot of product lives, biosimilars product, but they're not trying to access the US market in terms of having FDA regulations and all those. So I had a question, like, was it was the obstacle being scientific, or it was just kind of a logistic reason that you don't want it
actually
to access those
I'm not that closely involved with life sciences, but he has written a book about one of the things Mr. Ambani does is that you have to stand on your own feet type of thing after a few years. So obviously he had to make his money before he could get into new areas, right? So right now he's doing that. So but that's good, no, because you cannot be expected to be funded by the corporation, right? I mean, when I came in, my idea for the research is the same. If I don't deliver 10x value on what I do, I should be shut down. And right. So, we done a lot of the things when I say I commercialized things where I'm showing I can deliver value. And see, you can deliver value to existing business a lot quicker and sooner. Like JB Joshi was saying, there are a lot of things we can do quickly. The existing facilities, existing industries. So you have to absolutely do that. Otherwise, you don't see if you don't have today, you don't have tomorrow. I mean, the industrial R&D cannot survive like a university. I got to show my value every day I walk in. In fact, I tell my scientists, you're as good as today. Don't tell me. I got a lot of people who come in and they give me a big story about how great they are. They came from this, that. I said, look, I don't care. I never talk about my past. I wake up every day and I figure out what am I going to do today. For me, what exists is today, so I have tomorrow. I can talk about that. By the way, I have more than 50 patents and maybe close to 200 papers. But who cares? It doesn't matter. you know, like I was telling people on a cricket team, you know, you have to think about if you hire somebody on your team, don't hire them for a name you expect them to play today. They may have been great yesterday, so what? That's okay. World doesn't run on yesterday. World runs on tomorrow. I mean, just look at the valuations today of the industry, right? I mean, you look, the stock market is going up independent of what happens rest of the economy, right? Why? Because the expectation is that the future growth is there. So I think every scientist has to come to mind that he has to do something useful today for tomorrow. He cannot survive on what he did yesterday. If you don't have that attitude, you ain't going to wake up and be passionate and driven to do something. And that's what I mean by start something unknown. Because if you have something unknown, that will fire your passion to do something unforgettable. Just remember that one quote. Then you'll wake up every day and say, I want to do something new.
Sure. Okay, and just one last point before I leave you. So I just want to, regarding the the apprentice thing. I have myself worked in Pfizer in St. Louis for around 3 years, and then AstraZeneca. And I'm sure that you have also seen ExxonMobil. There are co-op programs where they regularly take students, both PhD level students and graduates. So I'm wondering, like, do Reliance is thinking of starting these kind of co-op programs over the summer, and kind of following those lines?
I mean, we have some of them, as I discussed. Maybe they're not broadly publicized, but I guess once the Geo Institute takes place, where I think the aspect of how the variety of industries and academia will come together and work will probably get more formalized. Okay. Today, the R&D is very focused on our existing plants and what we need to do to create businesses of the future, right? So we look at from a people perspective, not to build long-term capability, but to bring them in so that they can be educated about what we're doing today. Somewhat different than what Pfizer would or ExxonMobil would do, where there are some long-term, they always have this corporate programs, which are, completely high risk, high reward with no expectation something may come out. We're not there yet. Any of this is not there yet.
Okay. Oh, thank you. Thank you so much.
Well, we are getting there. Don't get me wrong. We're getting there.
So,
I mean, companies like Reliance are trying. We'll get there. I'm quite optimistic.
Thank you.
Since there are no more questions, I once again thank Dr. Sapre, and I hope that in near future also we'll be able to interact, and we'll start a new collaborative program, at least in the near future, for maybe for some doctoral students, internship program we can initiate for some of our students. And with
sure.
that,
I mean, JB Joshi, if he picks up a phone and tells me something, I cannot say no. So, you know exactly where to go to.
Yeah, we understand that part after your, yeah. Okay, thank you very much for spending so much time with us, and we hope such interaction in future. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Thanks again for giving me an opportunity. I'm not a regular public speaker, so